Welcome back to another Hand Drink Solo wine info video where we review curious wines for curious minds. And today we are engaging with one of the densest, inkiest, most bicep flexiest red wine cultivars in the entire world, Petite Sirah. Now, in order to kick off this little conversation, we have today's wine of the day, which is the RAAR Petite Sirah, which is made by winemaker Riebeek, using fruit that is 100% from the larger Swartland wine district. And this should come as no surprise because this wine is produced by the Riebeek Valley Wine Company, which very proudly only produces wines from the Swartland wine district. And they in themselves are a rather forward-thinking little outfit that could conceive of a wine range as epic and exploratory and adventurous as the RAAR wines. Petite Sirah was born in France in the 1860s out of an illicit affair between Syrah and Pelorsen. It was the kind of progeny that you get when you forget to properly roster supervision for the all-night youth group lock-in. This unsupervised erotic encounter took place in the botanical garden of a botanist named Francois Durif, and some other scientists who were a fan of this discovery went and named the grape Durif after Francois, but some less charitable scientists went, oh, that Francois, he's a tall poppy, naming a cultivar after himself. And he said, but it wasn't me. To this day, we don't know what to believe. Anyway, then the grape gets shipped to California, and there, through a process which to this day really defies any logical explanation, it ended up being called Petite Sirah. What makes it even worse is that it's not petite, and it's not even spelt the same way as Syrah, which is just only one portion of the idiocy of this entire tale. But despite all that, the name stuck. Fast forward to modern day, and 80% of Petite Sirah in the entire planet exists in the United States, more specifically in California, and particularly it flexes super hard in Lodi and Paso Robles. In fact, in California, they even have a kind of fan club for it called PS I Love You. But here's the kicker. South African vignerons and viticulturists seem to be developing their own little love affair with Petite Sirah, because in the last 15 years or so, the cultivar has grown in the South African National Vineyard by 3,000%, admittedly off a very low base. But there are about 500 hectares in South Africa at the moment. And so one would be well within their rights to ask, well, what is it that these winemakers see in the cultivar? And I thought, well, I could give you the textbook answer, but wouldn't it be more interesting to actually find out what the winemakers themselves have to say? And so I went and asked winemaker Riebeek, and as it turns out, her answer is fairly similar to the textbook answer. Petite Sirah is an amazing blending component for a whole number of reasons, because it has a whole lot of stuff going on. For starters, it has some really rather gargantuan tannins. And people say, oh, Pinot Noir, it's a steel fist and a silk glove. Well, Petite Sirah is an iron hoof in a suede football sock. Then, beyond the tannins, it also has incredibly concentrated, quite dynamic, velvety fruit flavors going on. It retains acid really well. And lastly, but not least, it has the most densest, inkiest, opaque color that you could possibly hope for. So much, in fact, that sometimes winemakers throw in just a little splash into their blends just to fix the color, because even a small little component like 5 or 10% can drastically alter the color of the entire wine. Now, for the most part, like any grapes in this sort of ilk, Tannat is not unlike it. The warmer climates can lead to these grapes producing wines that really are hulking bruisers. But if you can grow it in a slightly cooler climate, or have a little bit of altitude, or some very clever viticulture, as is the case with this wine, then all of a sudden the cultivar is capable of some nuance, some brighter, tarter, fresher red fruit elements that begin peeking out from the blackness. It's as if suddenly Petite Sirah knows how to waltz. It's like learning that John Cena can cry on cue in a rom-com, which he can. But that's all theory, really. So let's get into the glass and see practically what Riebeek has prepared for us. When we give this guy a sniff, well, there are some really delightful, rich fruit elements up front, superbly primary and extroverted. There's kind of black sugar plum, maraschino, cherry, blueberries. But then there's also some slightly more delicate elements, perhaps the kind of violet florals and deep red rose. And fascinatingly, over and above that, there's a little seam white pepper in there, which in itself is unusual because despite being the progeny of the Great Dame Syrah, which has rotundones in it, for the most part in warm climates like Swartland, Petite Sirah has less peppery elements, and usually that pepper note is fairly muted. But we know, because Cherie told us, that this particular wine has 30% whole bunch in it, which not only explains some of those candied fruit notes that I mentioned, but also some of the spice notes, because in grapes that have even some rotundone elements, there are always more rotundones in the stems than in the skins. So whole bunch is going to boost that spice note just a little. Now, when we progress to giving it a sip, well, the beautiful, deep, rich nose follows onto the palate extraordinarily well. So the blueberry fruit is there. The ripe black sugar plum is there. But there's also a little bit of a tartar, redder element. Some of that cherry comes through, and even a kind of wild blackberry just at the point before it turns black, and it's still kind of red in that zone. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, take a hike and find an unripe blackberry. But perhaps what's most impressive is, unsurprisingly, this amazing tannic, suede-like texture to the wine. We talked about suede tannins a few bottles ago and about what that means, but essentially these tannins are firm without being rough, and they're obvious without being unnecessarily drying. They almost conjure mental images of the actual plums and cherry skins that we discussed earlier on in the flavor notes. And so instead of being reminded of an old, dry, splintery barrel or some weedy stems, the tannins make you think more about the fruit. The tannins tell you about the fruit elements of the wine, and that really is incredibly pleasing. Winemaking sleuths may be surprised to learn that Cherie achieved this rather soft, svelte, tannic texture by leaving the wine in contact with those tanniny skins for an inordinately long amount of time. And if that sounds just completely insane and counterintuitive to you, then you're in luck, because I have left links to a video that explains post-fermentation maceration and how leaving tannins with your wine for longer actually ends up with softer, silkier tannins. And then I've left another link which tells you all about another South African Petite Sirah, which I think will give you a deeper understanding of just how cool the Petite Sirahs are that are coming out of the South African winelands.